today about the permission to say no. This idea that in our lives, we drive on this wheel. This is Charlie Chaplin, and he did this silly movie about work, and he gets caught up in these gears. And I thought, we so often get caught up in the gears of work, in the gears of life, in the gears of stress, in the gears of sorrow, in the gears of just being torn apart. And God says we can have permission to say no and to back up and stop. I don't know if you know this, but this month is Easter. In a couple weeks, we're going to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. And it got me thinking, how many Easters have you celebrated? For me, it's about 50. This year is my 50th Easter, because my parents brought us to church as soon as I was born, as soon as my brothers and sister were born. And we've been in about 50 Easters now. And it's not just a holiday. The thing that catches me sometimes off guard is that some people treat Easter like it's just another one of the holidays. You know what I mean? There's Easter stuff out already. There's bunny rabbits and there's candy and Peeps and all this stuff that's out. People treat it like it's Halloween or 4th of July or Christmas or a birthday. It's just another candy holiday. But the thought occurs to me this month, are we going to treat Easter just like it's a regular holiday, or are we going to actually become part of the resurrection of Jesus? Are you going to let Jesus be resurrected in your life this year? Are you going to let the power of the resurrection actually change how you see this year? Or is it just another holiday? I want you to know that it actually changes everything. It affects every way that we think and every thought that we have about new life. And I'm not the guy who made it up. The Apostle Paul actually makes it very clear in Ephesians chapter 2. He says it like this: but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive in Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. And it is by grace that you have been saved. God raised us up with him, with Christ, and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus. Can you just entertain me for a minute and look at the verbs? You know what verbs are? How long has it been since high school, right? Oh, wait, a verb, an adjective, a noun, preposition. Look at the past tense of the verbs. God made us alive in Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. Those are past tense. It is by grace that you have been saved. That's past tense. God raised us up. That's past tense with Christ, and he seated us with him in the heavenly realms. That's past tense. Did you know that the resurrection changes everything? And we're not just waiting for God to do something, although we want God to do things new in our life. We have the resurrection life now. We live in a life that's holy, that's different, that's set apart from the way the world sees. I've been reading a book this past month. It's called The Emotionally Healthy Leader. One of the reasons I'm reading it is because I'm emotional. That's not funny. And I want to be healthy, and I'm a leader. And this guy, Pete Scazzaro, it's an interesting name. He writes this book, and he speaks this truth, and he says how to transform your inner life that will deeply transform your church and your team and your world. And he talks about a weekly rhythm. And the weekly rhythm is really a rhythm of Sabbath. I want you to hear these 4 steps that he talks about. He says, stop your work, enjoy your rest, practice delight, and contemplate God. If we could, every weekend or every week, someday in the week, just practice stopping your work, enjoying some rest, practice delight, and contemplate God. I wish I could have 45 minutes to talk about all 4 of these things right now. I'll just talk about one today, stopping work. What does it actually mean? The Hebrew word for stopping is Shabbat. Can you say that? Shabbat. It's the word for Sabbath. It means rest. It means peace. It means to stop your productivity and actually trust that God will provide more for you than you can provide on your own. I heard a preacher say one time, God can do more in 6 days than you can do in 7 days. Because we need to rest and stop. Do you remember the person Harriet Tubman? Do you read about this in middle school? Harriet Tubman was from the 1840s, and she was the great emancipator. Thousands of slaves that she emancipated. She freed them during the Civil War era. And she's quoted as saying, "I freed thousands of slaves, and I wish I could have saved thousands more if only they had known they were slaves." You know how that strikes me is I think sometimes slavery gets us caught up in the thought of denial. When you don't know that you're a slave to something, you just stay in slavery to it. And Sabbath actually gets us to stop that slavery to work, that slavery to something. Slavery is often the outcome of ignorance or the outcome of denial. If we're not aware of what we're enslaved to, we'll just remain in bondage to that thing. So here's another way to say it. Didn't Jesus say the truth will set you free? When we understand the truth, another way to say that is awareness is a prerequisite to liberation. When you're aware of the things that enslave you, you then can find some freedom from those things. Have you ever been enslaved to something and you didn't know it? I mean, I could rattle off a list. But how often have we been enslaved or trapped by something? Even good things. There are good things that we can enjoy, but we get enslaved by them because they start to get control over us. Like people who drink wine or beer. Our son's turning 21 on Tuesday, so we had the alcohol talk again. We talked about how much is enough and how much is too much, or donuts. That's a snare in my life, right? Like, donuts are good things, but they can become bad things when we become enslaved to them. And even another thought is like shopping. Can shopping become enslaving? It starts out as, I need a new pair of shoes, and it turns into my identity is wrapped up in the things that I buy. Or work. Work can become a thing that we can become enslaved to because it turns into an identity piece. Like, I only am who I am because of the things that I do. This past month, Chris and I learned how to kind of unplug from life and unplug from work and take some Sabbath time off. And here's what I learned. If you peel back the pages of the Old Testament, you remember the portion in the Bible that sounds like all the rules, all the do's and don'ts. In fact, it could sound like God was angry and he hated the people. It's not true, but people who read the Old Testament say, well, that's when God was more wrathful and more angry. And that's not really true. If you really peel back the picture of the Old Testament and you look at how God spoke in the Old Testament, he gave people permission to say no. He's actually a loving God enough that he gave you permission to stop your work life. And here's a little bit of the context in Exodus chapter 20, when God finally gave the 10 Commandments to his people. He was giving them permission to say no. And the context was these people of Israel, about 2 million Hebrews, were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Have you done anything for 400 years? How many generations is 400 years? What's a generation? About 40 years? So do the math, about 10 generations. Have you ever done that Ancestry.com thing? I haven't done it, but I can only remember about 2 or 3 generations back. I know my parents, I know their parents, and I've heard about their parents. I don't know who the next 6 generations back is. But so for 40 generations, these people are enslaved to Pharaoh, and they've never had the permission to say no. And all of a sudden, they get out in the wilderness and God lets them go through the Red Sea, and they get out in the desert and God says, okay, now you're my new people and you now have permission to say no. You have permission to stop your work. Sabbath, God created as a lifestyle for people, a new way of life, a new freedom. But the problem is we kind of like our slavery, don't we? We like our slavery to things, my stuff, the stuff I buy, where I go shopping. We like our slavery to people. Some people control us. Some people are bullies. Some people we like to manipulate and control. We like our slavery to hobbies. I mean, I like golf. I like going out and doing things, but then it can trap me. I bought a motorcycle a couple years ago, and Boy, all the mechanics I put into that, all the time and energy it takes to keep that hobby going. Sometimes we have slavery to food. I mean, I don't want to say coffee, but I said it. Or chocolate or donuts or, right, like food can have control over us. And even work, sometimes we let work control us and it becomes an identity for us. Somebody said recently, a pastor friend of mine, Angel Flores, said, the problem with work in America is that we sometimes register it as noble. Oh, it's a noble job she does. Oh, it's your identity is wrapped up in that thing. So here's a question for you this morning. What are some of the things or the people or the interests that have control over you? What ways can you learn to say no? Maybe a question to write down on that blank side on the notes is, where do I need to say no in my life? What are things that are already trapping me? Where can I say no? I'm going to read this statement to you very slowly. Anything we've been given to enjoy outside of the boundaries of which it was designed to flourish only causes chaos and catastrophe and destruction, and we fashion them as idols. Should I say that again? Anything that we've been given to enjoy or outside the boundaries of which they were designed to flourish causes chaos and catastrophe and destruction, and we take things and we turn them into idols. And I believe God says, I want you to Sabbath from those things. I want you to take a break from those things. We've learned, my wife and I, in this past month to take a break from all that work. And I guess, to be honest, even for me, ministry can become enslaving. I can become addicted to wanting to serve people so that I get some identity back. You remember this guy, Charlton Heston? Moses? Do you remember the 10 Commandments? I can't get Charlton Heston out of my head. Every time I think of the 10 Commandments, I think of this old dude. And actually, if you look at these styrofoam blocks that he's holding, that's not even Hebrew. That's like scribble, scrabble, something. Those aren't even Hebrew letters. Like, it's so funny. They have nothing to do with Hebrew. But you remember, Moses was commanded by God to let my people go. Do you remember that? And he talked to Pharaoh and all that. And then he went in the wilderness with them, and God spoke these commands over his people. But I believe they were spoken as a gift. Have you ever thought of the 10 Commandments as a gift rather than all the rules? Of course, we shouldn't murder. We shouldn't commit adultery. We shouldn't lie. We shouldn't covet people's stuff. We should honor our parents. It's actually a gift to have a few boundaries in your life. It's a gift to have some margin in your life. Let me read for you the 10 Commandments on the screen. Are you ready? And God spoke all these words. Oh, time out. God actually spoke from the mountain all these words. This wasn't, Moses came down with these giant rock tablets and they were having golden calf ritual ceremonies and he broke the. This is before that. God actually spoke from the mountain and his voice thundered like thunder and trumpets. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. It's important to know that these people were identified as slaves and now they're identified as free people. You shall have no other gods before me. That's one. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven or above the earth or beneath or in the waters below. So 2 shall nots. Here's a third one. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. And it goes on. So 3 nots. And here's the fourth one. It's not a not. It's a remember. Isn't that interesting? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor in all your work, but on the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that was in them, but he rested. If you have your own Bible, circle those 3 words. But he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Have you ever thought to consider if God can rest? Maybe we can rest? It's just a thought. Unless you're better than God. I don't know. That's a good one. Verse 12, honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife or male or female servants or ox or donkey or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So out of the 10, the first 4 are about our relationship with God, and the next 6 are our relationship horizontally with other people. Did you notice that makes a shape of something? That's interesting. And so God says, I want you to honor me. I want you to honor the Sabbath. I heard a pastor say this last week. I can break 9 of the 10 commandments and be fired from my position in the church. There's one that if I work harder, I'll get a raise. If I break the Sabbath, if I just continue to work harder, people honor that. That's a tragedy. That's terrible. God says, I want you to stop your work and I want you to honor me. And the principle is Sabbath. The principle is to slow down and rest and stop. Why? Because he doesn't want us to be enslaved again in Egypt, not to be enslaved by our habits or enslaved by those things. But the problem is we forget. He said, remember, because we forget. We overdo it. We overcommit. We overdo too many things. And why did these people forget so easy? Because there were 40 generations of Hebrews in Egypt, and of course it's easy to forget. So God, in his kindness, had to take the people out of Egypt. But did you also notice God had to take Egypt out of the people? Because the people who were entrapped in Egypt had this new ritual, this new life, this new slavery to work and things. And if I just labor and work hard, then the king will be happy. Pharaoh, right? I won't die. But when I get out and get freedom with God, God says, I need to take that habit of overworking out of your life. What does God want to take out of your life? Have you ever thought of that? If God had to take Egypt out of his people, what does God have to take out of your life? Are you overdoing something in your life? Are you working too hard? Are you stressed too much? Do you have too much anxiety about something because you can't let it go because it has control over you? Where does God want you to have freedom? You see, with a slave mentality, without an experience of rest or a concept of margin or a way to take a breath, you just stay trapped in your misunderstanding. And then even the Sabbath became slavery to the Hebrews. Did you know that? The Jews later in Jesus' time, they started worshiping the Sabbath day because God had said, make it holy. So they made it so holy that it became against the law to do anything on the Sabbath. And then Jesus comes along and he starts to break the Sabbath by healing people. I read this morning in Matthew 12 that Jesus gets in an argument with the Pharisees. He's like, if one of your sheep fell into a ditch, wouldn't you pick it up on a Sabbath day? It's like one of your, let alone a human. Wouldn't you want to heal a human being? And then he heals this guy with his withered hand. Jesus does this work, and immediately the Pharisees said, we got to figure out how to kill him. We got to figure out how to get rid of this guy because he's bending the rules again. So Sabbath is such an interesting concept. Jesus even went away to lonely places so he could pray. Jesus took time away even from his ministry. Of all things, Jesus took a break from working. Do you have a weekly practice of Sabbath in your life? I mean, do you practice anything to slow your life down? I have friends from seminary that on Thursday afternoon, Thursday night, they prepare some meals for the weekend so that they don't cook on Saturday. It's great. They make some meals ahead of time. And then on Friday, they make sure that they just rest. Doesn't mean you have to sit home and shave your head and wear a robe and sit in front of a candle and moan. But it does mean, like, where can I slow my life down? Where can I unplug from things? I know other people that turn off their cell phone and they don't even answer their phone all weekend. Can you do that? Woo! That's hard. I don't know if I could do that. Can you actually turn it off? Let me get practical for a minute. Let's get really real. I have just a couple minutes left. I want to show you an image. If you look at the concept of our Christian faith, there's 3 words that I want you to know. One of them is justification. Can you say justification? Justification is this idea of being justified. It's that the fact that God saved you means your life is transformed, okay? In Ephesians, Paul says, God did the work of saving you, and now you're on this journey with him. It's like starting blocks in a race. The justice part of justification means God did the work. Legally, you're bound to God now, okay? If you've come to faith. And you start the race. And then when you die, it's called glorification. Many of you looking forward to that? Glorification is this idea of actually finally going to be with the Lord. Man, the longer I live, the more conversations I hear about, oh, can't wait. Like, just waiting for God to come back. Just waiting to die. I'm like, wow, what kind of a life is that? Anyway, what do you do in the short little span between your birth date and your death date? You know that little dash on your tombstone? What's that word called? It's called sanctification. Sanctify comes from the word made holy. It comes from the idea of God processing this work of being made holy in your life. Sanctity is this definition of holiness. Now, do you do the work of holiness? Or does God do the work? There's this potter's wheel picture, and God is the one. Have you ever played with pottery? And take a lump of clay and you throw it down on this potter's wheel and the wheel spins, and you either spin it with your foot or you have an electronic wheel, and if it gets out of balance it warbles and then this clay falls off of the wheel if it's spinning too fast. Boy, there's a metaphor for life. If your life spins too fast, does it get out of balance? But God says, you are my lump of clay and I'm the potter. Here's an image that works for me in my life. I have this little 4-foot step ladder. Okay, bought this little thing to help finish my basement. Now, I think in the Christian life, sometimes we think our Christian faith is about climbing the ladder. You know what I mean? If I go to church every weekend and I'm committed to more religious things, I'll be a good person. If I climb up the next step and I do all the right things and I start to judge other people who are doing wrong things, and I read the Bible more and I get more into my faith, I become a better Christian. I would climb the ladder more, but some of you look nervous. I know, I saw it. Isn't that another metaphor for life? Sometimes we climb a ladder and it's not resting on the right wall. It's not secured right. It's not right. You're looking nervous to me. But in our life, sometimes we think we can keep climbing this ladder and we become better for God. And the higher I go, then God must be happy with me. God must want to save me. God, if I make God happy, then, God will just save my life. Do you know how many of us live our Christian life like that? And the problem is, it's all upside down. God actually says, it's not about going up, it's about going down. Your life is this picture where we trust that God has done this work. And God says, I've come to give you rest. I've come to give you life. I've come to give you Sabbath so that you can stop your pursuit of climbing up. You can actually go down. You can actually become one who gets to rest in me. I didn't grow up Catholic, but my wife and I had the opportunity to go to St. Patrick's Church in Manhattan. Look at this baby. This thing is a humongous cathedral. I don't even know how big it is. But it was Ash Wednesday, and my wife and I got to explore this. This is where the presidents go to church. This is where Congress, where the people, this is a big deal. And it was Ash Wednesday, and I decided I'm going to go forward and get my ashes. So I walked up to the priest, and the priest took this ashes, which was from Palm Sunday the year before. They burn the palms, and they keep the ashes for a year, and then he marked on my forehead. And again, I'm not Catholic, and it's okay if you grew up Catholic. How many of you remember what the ashes means? Yeah. And he put this mark on my forehead, and he says, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. From ashes you came, and from ashes you will return. And it reminded me, it's not a religious thing that makes me better with God. It's a reminder that God says, I want you to die in your life. I want you to learn to let your life die. I want you to die to yourself. And for the next few hours, the next few days, I started realizing, what is it in my life that I need to die to? Where do I need to go down in my life and let God have the victory over me? So here's a question for you this morning. What in your life do you need to give up? What in your life do you need to let die? What can you sacrifice in your life? Is it an attitude of bitterness? A physical thing? Is it money? Is it shopping? Is it something that has a grip over you? Or is it something you can say, God, I need to give you glory and say no to that thing in my own life? You know, the resurrection is only real when we let Jesus be resurrected in us. When we let God resurrect new life in us. It's not about climbing up and down ladders. It's saying, Jesus, you're enough. So in your life, this week, where is God asking you to rest? How can you form a habit of, I just need to rest and trust that God is greater? But I want you to look at this stool that Grady made for me. He didn't know this, but this is a perfect image for today's sermon. Do you know why? Because I think in our life we need to learn how to rest. We need to learn how to trust that God has made a way for us to stop striving, to stop working harder, to stop trying to be all that we are so that God will be happy. You know what? God says, just sit down. Just rest every weekend. Just trust that I've got the world under control. Can you do that in your life? This week, what's one thing that God says, I want you to stop doing this and stop striving so that I can actually fulfill you more? What's one thing you can do? And I want you to receive the blessing before you go today. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace both now and forevermore. Amen? Amen. Go with God.